Isaiah 13. A prophecy against Babylon that Isaiah, son of Amos, saw. Raise a banner on a bare hilltop. Shout to them, beckon to them to enter the gates of the nobles. I commanded those I prepared for battle. I have summoned my warriors to carry out my wrath, those who rejoice in my triumph. Listen, a noise on the mountains like that of a great multitude. Listen, an uproar among the kingdoms like nations massing together. The Lord Almighty is mustering an army for war. They come from faraway lands, from the ends of the heavens, the Lord and the weapons of his wrath, to destroy the whole country. Wail, for the day of the Lord is near. It will come like destruction from the Almighty. Because of this, all hands will go limp. Every heart will melt with fear. Terror will seize them. Pain and anguish will grip them. They will writhe like a woman in labor. They will look aghast at each other, their faces aflame. See, the day of the Lord is coming, a cruel day, with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land desolate and destroy the sinners within it. The stars of heaven and their constellations will not show their light. The rising sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. I'll punish the world for its evil, the wicked for their sins. I'll put an end to the arrogance of the haughty and will humble the pride of the ruthless. I will make people scarcer than pure gold, more rare than the gold of Ophir. Therefore, I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will shake from its place at the wrath of the Lord Almighty in the day of his burning anger. Like a hunted gazelle, like sheep without a shepherd, they will all return to their own people. They will flee to their native land. Whoever is captured will be thrust through. All who are caught will fall by the sword. Their infants will be dashed to pieces before their eyes. Their houses will be looted and their wives violated. See, I will stir up against them the Medes, who do not care for silver and have no delight in gold. Their bows will strike down the young men. They will have no mercy on infants, nor will they look with compassion on children. Babylon, the jewel of kingdoms, the pride and glory of the Babylonians, will be overthrown by God like Sodom and Gomorrah. She will never be inhabited or lived in through all generations. There no nomads will pitch their tents. There no shepherds will rest their flocks, but desert creatures will lie there. Jackals will fill their houses. There the owls will dwell, and there the wild goats will leap about. Hyenas will inhabit her strongholds, jackals her luxurious palaces. Her time is at hand, and her days will not be prolonged.
Well, speaking of ominous, right? You know, today has been an interesting day. Last night I had some shoulder pain, and so I was attempting to take some Tylenol. I'm a weirdo with medicines. If I take medicines, it messes with me, so I take almost no medicine except for Tylenol. And after I took the Tylenol last night, I looked at the bottle, and it was a Tylenol PM. And that's not a big deal for most people, but for me, ask my wife, it makes me a freak. I don't know what it is. And so I see things, and I'm just not in the right state of mind. And so I'm up really late, and I told my wife before I went to bed, I was like, when my alarm goes off, you have to wake me up because I'm not going to wake up. I know I'm going to have a long night. I know it's going to be a weird night. And so I set my alarm for 2 a.m., and at about 4:30 this morning, I was getting kicked in the back by my wife. And she's like, you told me to wake you up. And I looked at the clock, and I was like, yeah, 2.5 hours ago, right? I like to come here early and to prepare. And anyways, all that to say, as we were singing that song, Be Thou My Vision, I really felt humbled, and there's this great opportunity to just open God's Word and just submit to that, right? And that's what we're going to do this morning. I'm so thrilled that we're studying Isaiah. I know that Isaiah is not easy. I commend you for studying it with me, for reading the devotions from others as we've been studying it. And we've been learning a lot, right? I encourage you to stick with it. First 39 chapters in particular are pretty challenging, but we're working through it. And what I want you to see is there's this beautiful message coming, right? We see this deep darkness that is the world, and we're going to talk a lot about that today. But just like we talked about last week, there's this deep contrast of light. There's this kingdom that we find ourselves in, the kingdom that Christ brings. And so there's this beautiful message here. And we're coming off what would be a really encouraging passage from last week. We saw this message of hope as we look forward to this kingdom of peace, this kingdom of unity that will be experienced upon the return of Christ. But today we see something that must come first, the day of the Lord. Now what is interesting is that the Lord will use an actual event in Isaiah's future, it's in our past, but Isaiah's future, to give us a picture of this day of the Lord. And all of this is contained in one passage, right? So we see this past event for us that has happened. Isaiah said it would happen through the Lord speaking to him, and it did happen, okay? And then we also see this future event that is future for us, and it's this judgment of the world as we see this empire of Babylon being this picture of what will need to still be judged. Now, it's important to note that at the time that Isaiah prophesies this, as he talks about Babylon, okay, he's speaking of Babylon falling, but at the time, nobody really cares about Babylon. Everyone's worried about the Assyrians. Okay, which is really interesting if you think about it. Okay, at the time, okay, he's talking about the fall of Babylon, but Babylon doesn't have that far to fall. Okay, they're not an empire yet. And so this really speaks profoundly into God definitely speaking through Isaiah, right? He's speaking of an empire to fall that's not even an empire yet. Okay, and so Isaiah speaks of the fall of Babylon, which is much closer to a city at this point than an empire. At the time of this prophecy, it's the Assyrians that everyone would be worried about. And not only is he prophesying of the fall of the Assyrians, right? If the Babylonians are going to rise up in power, he's also prophesying of the fall of the Assyrians, right? Syrians have to fall so the Babylonians can rise. And so the Assyrians must fall, the Babylonians must rise. And then this prophecy happens, and as Isaiah talks about it, there's another kingdom, there's another nation that's going to conquer Babylon. We're going to see the fall of Babylon, and at this point in time, that kingdom, that nation, the Medes, they have just established their first king. Okay, so it's not like Isaiah is talking about these different world powers that are already powerful going to war against each other. He's speaking towards the future. Okay, and on all of these things that are going to happen, okay, these are going to happen 100 years after Isaiah is dead. Isn't that encouraging? That God speaks the future through Isaiah. If we're going to try to think about it in our own context, we could think about it this way. Okay, think of a current world power. Someone give me a current world power. China. Okay, China, current world power. Everybody would probably agree with that, right? Someone give me another country that's definitely not a world power. Uganda. Okay, that's a really good picture of what's happening here. Isaiah is essentially saying Uganda will be a world power. China will fall. And then not only that, another country. Give me another country that's not a world power. Honduras. There you go, Honduras. And so that's the picture here. That's essentially what Isaiah would be saying, that Uganda is going to rise and then Honduras is going to conquer them. Okay, could you imagine someone saying that? That's essentially what Isaiah is saying. These empires that are not empires, he's already talking about their fall many years before they would even rise. Okay, and so Isaiah's prophecy certainly would have been far-fetched for those who hear it, but we can look back in history and see that all of this unfolds exactly the way that Isaiah said it would. Now, ultimately, the point to draw from this is that when God says something will happen, it happens. right? When God says something will happen, it happens. We see the day of the Lord and the fall of the world. That's contained in the same passage. And so that too will happen. Okay, and those are the two things that we're going to see in our passage today. So open with me to Isaiah chapter 13. We're going to kind of bounce around here a little bit, but we're going to start in verse 1. Verse 1 says, "A prophecy against Babylon that Isaiah, son of Amos, saw." Now, the first verse is actually quite important because it's a timestamp, right? You see, these things that Isaiah will speak of don't happen until 100 years after he dies. And I think that that's really important. That's significant. And if you're a historian, okay, what do you do with this knowledge? Especially if you're a historian, you're not a follower of Christ, you're not a believer. What do you do with this knowledge? Because what Isaiah says will happen, we can look in history books, even outside of Scripture, we can look in history books and see these things do in fact happen. Okay, this would be like if Abraham Lincoln predicted Pearl Harbor. Okay, that's the picture here. Okay, and that is why some historians say Isaiah couldn't have wrote this chapter, and there's not a shred of evidence to suggest that that would be true. In fact, it says that he did write it, but it's so profound, it's so amazing that he would predict these things. The historians have a hard time with this. Okay, and so Isaiah speaks of the future, and quite accurately, I might add. Okay, and so let's start with the second half of the passage of Isaiah, because we're going to see Babylon spoken of by name, and so we know exactly what Isaiah is talking about. And then we're going to go back and talk about some future implications for us. And so we're going to start here in verse 14. We're going to see kind of the nature of Babylon's destruction. We're going to see it's very graphic. It's hard to read. And then you'll also see Babylon spoken of by name. Also, the Medes who will conquer them are spoken of by name here too. So we know exactly what's being talked about. Verse 14 says, "Like a hunted gazelle, like sheep without a shepherd, they will all return to their own people. They will flee to their native land. Whoever is captured will be thrust through. All who are caught will fall to the sword. Their infants will be dashed to pieces before their eyes. Their houses will be looted and their wives violated. See, I will stir up against them the Medes." Okay, so it's the Medes who are doing these terrible things. Who do not care for silver, who do not delight in gold. Their bows will strike down the young men. They will have no mercy on infants, nor will they look with compassion on children. Babylon, the jewel of kingdoms, the pride and glory of the Babylonians, will be overthrown by God like Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, so this is speaking towards this fall of Babylon. Okay, and it's brutal, isn't it? Would you guys agree that that's a pretty brutal description of being conquered? I think one of the reasons it's so brutal is because for the Medes, this isn't just about expansion. Okay, these people are ruthless, aren't they? They're different than the Babylonians in that the Babylonians seem to be really driven by greed and the pursuit of riches. But the Medes, they are the destroyers, right? They come to destroy. So the Medes will destroy the Babylonians as if they are Sodom and Gomorrah, which is quite a statement, really. And as it turns out, this statement in Isaiah's future will turn out to be aligned with perfectly with history. In fact, I think that the Bible is the best historical document ever written. What do you guys think? This talks about the Babylonians being conquered. And you can actually go to the book of Daniel. I'm not going to read the whole chapter today. But on your own time, I encourage you, read Daniel chapter 5, because we actually get to see this happen. Okay, Daniel is actually in Babylon when this happens, when what Isaiah prophesies happens 100 years later or so. Okay, and so what we see happening here, okay, remember this is the writing on the wall passage. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. If not, that's okay. But what we see, this does in fact happen. The Medes and the Persians, they conquer Babylon in a single night. Okay, go read Daniel chapter 5. You can read all about it. But it's this passage with the writing on the wall. And it is exactly the event that Isaiah is prophesying about. Daniel chapter 5, we see this king of Babylon. Okay, he's throwing this party. He's invited like 1,000 delegates, I think it is. And what they're doing is they're drinking out of goblets. So it's a party. They're drinking. They're drinking out of goblets, golden goblets that they had retrieved from the temple of Jerusalem. Okay, and so as they're doing this, they're mocking the Lord, right? And they're praising the God of gold and the God of silver, raising up material things as their God. And we'll see that they're in a terrible position to mock the Lord. They've elevated themselves to the position of God. They've elevated these material possessions to the position of God. And maybe some of you are familiar with what happens here in Daniel chapter 5. In the middle of the king's party, as they are drinking from these golden goblets from God's temple, they see this hand, they see this finger, and it begins writing on the plaster of the wall. And it freaks them out, right? Imagine if we saw a finger on that wall writing something, it would probably catch all of our attention too. And so it freaks him out. Daniel chapter 5, verse 5 says, "The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking." You can see that picture in your head, can't you? At this point, they're trying to figure out what this writing on the wall means, and they're bringing in sorcerers and all sorts of different things. And finally, they come to Daniel, and Daniel gives them the bad news of what this means. See this in verse 25. It says, "This inscription that was written, mean, tekel, parson, here's what the words mean. God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians." Okay, so sure enough, just as Isaiah prophesied and then Daniel confirmed, Babylon would be taken by the Medes. The king who mocked the Lord would in fact be slain that very night. Darius of the Medes would take over the kingdom of Babylon. Okay, so why is this so significant? Okay, I know that not everyone is extremely interested in history. Some of you are, some of you aren't. Okay, and maybe the brutality of this, maybe that turns some of you off to it too. So why are we teaching Isaiah chapter 13? What's so significant about this chapter? Well, God says Babylon will be destroyed, and Babylon's destroyed. What God says will happen, and this chapter is not just about Babylon. I read verses 14 through 19 because it's absolutely talking about Babylon, right? It names them by name. But throughout the Bible, we see that Babylon isn't just Babylon. It's a type, right? Babylon is a picture of those who would elevate themselves above God. In Isaiah chapter 13, it's not just talking about the destruction of Babylon. Okay, we see that very clearly, but there's a prophecy in our future as well. And so Isaiah chapter 13 is talking about this destruction of the world, if you will. People like to talk about Armageddon, okay, but we are talking about the end in a way here. Okay, it's talking about God's judgment, not just on Babylon, but God's judgment on what Babylon represents. Okay, and you can see this really clearly in the first 13 verses, and so that's where I want to go now. Okay, the first 6 you'll see reference to Babylon, and then after that you're going to see very clearly we're talking about something different. Starting in verse 2, it says, raise a banner on a bare hilltop. Shout to them, beckon them to enter the gates of the nobles. I have commanded those I prepared for battle. I have summoned my warriors to carry out my wrath, those who rejoice in my triumph. Listen, a noise on the mountains like that of a great multitude. Listen, an uproar among the kingdoms like nations massing together. The Lord Almighty is mustering an army for war. They have come from faraway lands, from the ends of the heavens, the Lord and the weapons of his wrath to destroy the whole country. Okay, so we as we start the chapter here, it definitely seems to be talking about the nation of Babylon, right? The whole country will be destroyed, it says. Okay, it talks about the massing together of nations. This would be the Persians and the Medes who came together to conquer Babylon. Okay, and I think that that's pretty clear here. And remember, we see this specifically talked about in verse 17, that it's definitely Babylon. And we saw in 19 that it's definitely being conquered by the Medes. So I think that's very specific to an event that has happened in history, the Medo-Persian army conquering Babylon. But now, as we get past verse 6, you'll start to see that the language that is used here really starts to change. And we start to see that we must be talking about something more than just Babylon. Okay, Isaiah specifically prophesies of the rise and the fall of the empire of Babylon, but he's going to be speaking of something more significant here as we continue here in verse 6. And verse 6 says this, it says, "Wail, for the day of the Lord is near. It will come like destruction from the Almighty. Because of this, all hands will go limp, every heart will melt with fear. Terror will seize them, pain and anguish will grip them. They will writhe like a woman in labor. They will look aghast at each other, their faces aflame. See, the day of the Lord is coming, a cruel day with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land desolate and destroy the sinners with it. The stars of heaven and their constellations will not show their light. The rising sun will be darkened. The moon will not give its light. I will punish the world for its evil, the wicked for their sins. I will put an end to the arrogance of the haughty, and I will humble the pride of the ruthless. I will make the people scarcer than pure gold, more rare than gold of Ophir. Therefore, I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will shake from its place at the wrath of the Lord Almighty, in the day of his burning anger." Even as you read that, even at a glance, you can see that we're talking about more than just Babylon, right? The language here is now towards this day of the Lord. That's why I had you guys watch that video here. In fact, the day of the Lord, that term, it's used twice here. First time it's used, it says that it will come like destruction from the Almighty. And the second time, it will be a cruel day of the Lord with fierce wrath and anger to destroy sinners. The day of the Lord is almost always used to speak of this judgment towards the end times. And along with it, we see language here that is very similar to Jesus' language in Matthew chapter 24. Okay, I encourage you to go read that chapter this week as well. Matthew chapter 24 is very similar to this chapter, and those are Jesus' words. Okay, in both Isaiah 13 and Matthew 24, we see cosmic events of the stars and the sun. In both places, we see fear and terror. In both places, we see earthquakes, we see shaking of the heavens, shaking of the earth. It's described as this great distress that is unmatched by anything that came before it. Darkness, destruction, and fear. And we know for sure that Jesus is talking about the same thing as Isaiah is, because Jesus quotes this verse. He quotes Isaiah chapter 13. Matthew 24, verse 29, Jesus says, "Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened." This is from Isaiah chapter 13. "And the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken." Okay, then we see the context of what Jesus is talking about in the next verse. "Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then all the people of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other." Okay, so the same event that's being described here in Isaiah 13 is being described by Jesus in Matthew 24. And I think it's important for us to understand this, because when we look at the fall of Babylon and the fact that that really did happen, it happened just as Isaiah prophesied. It's important that we also see the second part of this prophecy and know that the day of the Lord is a reality, right? It's a reality that will come. We can look in history and see what happened to Babylon. It falls just the way Isaiah prophesied, right? So will the world. We can be confident that what God says will happen will happen. And I think it's helpful to look back and see in history that what God said would happen would happen. That we know what God says will come to pass. Does that make sense? Now, beyond all that, I think what I really would like us to see this morning, if the day of the Lord is really going to bring destruction, like we just read, if Jesus is going to return and he's going to judge, if that judgment leads to destruction, I think it's important to ask, what is it that Jesus will be judging? What is it that Jesus will be destroying on the day of the Lord? Right? Do you think that's a good question to ask? And the answer is Babylon. And I want you to understand what I'm saying, but look at Revelation chapter 18, verse 10. It says, they will stand far off in fear of her torment and say, alas, alas, you great city, you mighty city, Babylon, for in a single hour your judgment has come. Babylon will fall in the same way in Revelation as it did in history, but this time we're not just talking about a city, and we're not just talking about a nation. Okay, and so I want us to see the picture that's supposed to be created here. Babylon's not just a city or a nation. Babylon has been a picture of God's opposition since the beginning. Okay, we see this all the way back in Genesis at the Tower of Babel. Okay, Babylon, right? Okay, so this chapter, not just the destruction of a city or a nation. It's about the final destruction of Babylon. Okay, so what is Babylon? Yeah, think back to last week's message if you were here. We talked about the kingdom of Jesus, the kingdom that we'll experience under his reign. We talk about what he will establish for those who follow him. We talk about this perfect peace, this unity of all things, this picture all the way back to the garden, right? That Jesus will redeem all things. In other words, God's will and God's way will experience those things, the unity of all things. Well, in the Garden of Eden, I think is where we actually see this first picture of Babylon. Okay, so what are we talking about here? Babylon represents humanity's choice to set aside God and elevate themselves to the position of God. That humanity would take upon itself the role of deciding what is good, what is evil. And in its very nature, what Babylon represents, it's elevating one's self to the place of God. Okay, and so in the garden, what we see what God has provided. He's provided the unity of all things. There's peace and there's comfort and there's provision, but humanity decides that it wants to rule. They wanted to decide what was right. They wanted to decide what was good. And that's the first picture, and maybe that's my opinion, but that's the first picture of Babylon. And it's not long after this, it's only I think 9 chapters after this that we actually see the birth of Babylon in the Tower of Babel, the very source of Babylon. Okay, what do we see? Humanity thinks they have it all figured out, right? And so they think that they don't need God. They don't want God. They want to decide, right? They want to elevate themselves to the heavens. And so the story of Babel. And only to see the story of Babel happening over and over and over again throughout all of human history. Okay, we see Babylon in the Egyptians, right? A ruler elevating himself to the place of God. See, this is Babylon, right? The Assyrians would eventually take Babylon's place as they looked at themselves as the conqueror of gods. They go to different nations and say that they've conquered their gods. And then Babylon itself would be put in world power. And of course, this cycle continues. Babylon represents man's own way. It represents mankind as God, where we make the decisions, where we're in charge. And we've set aside God and we've elevated ourselves so that our life is no longer about following the ways of our Creator, but following what is pleasurable in our own eyes. So what we have here is this picture of free will and what humanity has done with that free will, that we would use that free will to abandon the ways of the Lord. This goes all the way back to the garden, to elevate ourselves above the Lord. And this is the picture of Babylon. Okay, and within this picture of Babylon, we always find oppression, we always find perversion, we always find selfishness and maliciousness and destruction. That's the story of humanity, isn't it? And just when it all seems so hopeless, and it feels hopeless in this room right now, just when it all feels so hopeless, as this cycle of Babylon continues over and over and over again, something happens, right? Something happens. A child is born, and for the first time, we see an entire life devoted to God's will. The cycle of Babylon has missed human flesh for the first time in all of history. And what is that child's name? Yeah. Remember what we read in Isaiah chapter 7? Emmanuel, Jesus, God with us, the Messiah, Jesus Christ, God born in the flesh. And Jesus has brought something new. Jesus has broken the cycle. Jesus comes and he does something different than what was expected, doesn't he? As we're studying Isaiah, maybe we're coming to a better understanding of why Jesus' followers wanted him to destroy Rome. You remember that? Do you have a better understanding of maybe why they thought that? They wanted Jesus to rise up as governor. Why? Because Rome was the new Babylon, right? So it seems like Jesus must have come to rise to power, to overthrow Rome. Rome, which would fit the bill of Babylon. Do you see the picture here? That is why Jesus' disciples thought he was coming to overthrow, to destroy. But Jesus does not take on the ways of the world. He does not take on the way of Babylon, and instead of the death and destruction of Rome or Babylon, what do we see? We see that Jesus allows for Babylon to take his life. Do you see the picture here? And for the first time, we see a new picture as Jesus would put on his shoulders Babylon, as he would take on sin, right? And for the first time, we see God's complete wrath and judgment on Babylon. And who's carrying Babylon? Jesus, right? Do you see the picture here? Jesus takes on your sin. Jesus would take on your will, the will of humanity to have their own way. He takes this upon himself. This will of man to elevate themselves above God, humanity's way of selfishness and oppression and violence and greed. He would take your sin upon himself. And so Jesus would bear the weight of Babylon. He would bear the weight of sin. And as we see in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. And so we see this judgment that was meant for Babylon, aka humanity, right, is experienced by Jesus. And so again, in a very different way, we see the judgment of Babylon. But Jesus isn't conquered by this evil, right? Amen? Because in death and in resurrection, he overcomes this. We see that Jesus is victorious over death. And what is Babylon's most powerful weapon? Death, right? We see Jesus victorious over sin. And what is the ways of Babylon? Sin. Ultimately, what we see is Jesus offering this new way. For the first time in all of history, a human has overcome the ways of Babylon. He has resisted the ways of Babylon. Do you see the picture here? Do you guys see the picture here? Do you see the gospel here? Jesus shows us this example of a new way. And you see, we as followers of Christ, we're called to live in this new way. I think it's important for us to look around the world, and we see Babylon, don't we? Don't we see sin? Don't we see this way of life in the world around us? The message of this world is my life, right? My way. Elevating themselves to the place of God, That's the way of Babel. That's the way of Babylon. They want to rule as king, right? Babel is about taking the Lord off of his throne so that we can decide. But Jesus offers something different, doesn't he? And the promise that we see is that there will be a people, and this is a promise, there will be a people, God's people, who will put Christ on his rightful throne, right? Followers of Christ. And we will live as he lived. And it's a people, God's people, who would choose God's will over our will, who would choose generosity over greed, who would choose peace over violence, who would choose restoration instead of destruction, people who will choose love instead of hatred, who will choose God's way instead of their own. That is the life of Jesus, isn't it? The only man who ever lived that lived out God's will perfectly, as he would say, not my will, but thine be done. And so Jesus came to take the place of Babylon. And you know, he came offering grace, didn't he? He came offering forgiveness. And may we understand that he came offering a new way of living. God's way. Those who experience Jesus, those who experience God's way, man, they will be blessed. Are you blessed? There's a new way of living, and that comes in some circumstances that are really fun and circumstances that aren't, but you are blessed. That's the message here. We will experience what this description of the kingdom that we talked about last week, and Jesus will eventually return to judge Babylon one last time, and then offering this kingdom of blessing for those who have chosen Jesus, those who have chosen God's way, those who have submitted themselves to Christ. It's by what he's done that we've been invited out of death and out of darkness and out of sin into something new. That we are a new creation, we are a new life. Those who have elevated Jesus to his rightful throne. So may we think about his will. May we think about his way. I'm going to invite the worship team to come forward. And I'd actually love for you guys to sing Be Thou My Vision again. And I want you to really think about this new vision, this new thought, this new idea, this new way of living that Jesus brought with him. That is so far from this darkness of the world. He's called us into something new. And so let's reflect on that. Lord, I thank you for the message of your gospel. I thank you that you've come to conquer evil, and you've come to conquer death, and you've come to conquer sin. I thank you for the picture that we see of that in Isaiah. Lord, may we hold on to this hope that you've invited us to the kingdom. This new way of living. May we experience this now, Lord, as we continue to extend grace and love and compassion to the world around us. May we carry your light with us. And Lord, as we go into this world, may we do as you did. Okay, you preached that the kingdom was to come. We saw in Isaiah that the day of the Lord is at hand, but you taught that the kingdom is at hand. And so may we go out and preach the kingdom. May we have an understanding of what is to come, but may we be so void of fear. May we have no fear of that, Lord, because we trust you. Our hope is in you. And you've come to conquer evil. You've come to conquer death and destruction. And you've came to remove those things from us. And Lord, so may we see the tendencies of Babylon in our own lives, the tendencies towards sin and darkness in our own lives. And may we move away from those things. May we move into something new. Lord, I thank you that you're doing this work in all of us. May you be our vision. May you be our light. May you be our guide. May we move towards you, Lord, and may we bring you to the world around us. In Jesus' name.